This page looks a lot like the page that we did yesterday, but yesterday, all we were working on, or all we were working with, are the tenths. Today, we're going to work with even smaller decimals. If you look at our place value chart, now instead of having just tenth, it also has another place value called the hundredth. If you take a look at our models are a lot, well, they look similar, but the pieces are a lot smaller than they were yesterday. Yesterday, the pieces of our model were just lines. Now we have these little itty bitty squares. If we took the time and we counted every single one of these little squares that make up this big model, we would see that there are 100. There are 100 little teeny tiny squares inside this model. That's why they call this the hundredths place. Now, JD, yesterday you asked a very good question about the tenths. You asked me, why do you write the dimes on top of the tenths?
Yeah.
And I told you it's because dimes, in our money, it takes 10 dimes to make a dollar, right?
Yes.
Okay, we're going to do something similar with the hundredths. The only difference is this one says hundredths. So I can't put dimes because it doesn't take 100 dimes to make a dollar. It only
Yeah.
takes 10. So those are for our tenths. So the tenths stay the same. I write dimes and I write 0.1 on top of the tenths place.
Yeah.
But the hundredths, what kind of coin do you need 100 of to make a dollar?
A quarter?
Not a quarter. Quarter, I only need 4. Haley?
A penny?
A penny. So my hundredths aren't dimes, they're pennies. Because it takes 100 pennies, 100 cents to make that dollar. On top of the hundredths, I don't just write pennies, I also write the decimal. What would 100th look like in a decimal? It looks kind of similar to the tenth, but there's a big difference. I'm going to write 0.01. So my tenths are 0.1. My hundredths are 0.01. And if you look at the numbers, you can kind of tell them apart because on top of the tenths, it kind of looks like I wrote the number 10 backwards, 0, 1. On top of the hundredths, it kind of looks like I wrote 100 backwards, 0, 0, 1. So the tenths have 0.1 and the hundredths have 0.01. And again, anytime I have a place value chart that uses decimals, I always write those two things down. So we're going to start with model A. And we're going to see how well we're able to color. Here's what I want you to do. On model A, I want you to take your pencil and I want you to color in or to shade in. Let's do 7. 7 of the little tiny squares. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 of the little tiny squares. And if you look at it, I didn't even finish a whole line. Only 7 little tiny squares. Now we're going to fill in our place value chart using that same model. The ones place. The ones place are like the whole models. If I look here at my model, there's definitely not the whole thing shaded in. There's a lot of blank space on this model. So in the ones place, I have a 0. I don't have any whole models shaded in. I've got a lot of blank space, a lot of empty space still left in that model. Now, Kaylee, you don't want to shade in like that. You want to shade in a straight line. If you go horizontally like this way, or if you shade up and down, either way is fine. And you'll see why in a little bit. The 10th. Now remember the models from yesterday. The 10ths just had lines, right? It was just 10 lines that made up the square. The 10ths are still here. If I count how many rows or how many columns of boxes they have, look how many there are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So the 10ths are still here in my model. I still have 10 different columns. If I look at model A, I started to shade in a 10th, but I didn't finish it. No shading on these last couple of boxes here in that 10th. So 0 tenths. And Kaylee, this is why I was telling you about shading in straight lines, because if you shade in straight lines, you're able to very quickly see, okay, did I shade in a whole 10th or not? If you kind of shade in like in diagonally, or if you kind of just shade in whichever boxes you want, you can't see very quickly, oh, okay, did I shade in a whole line or a whole row or not? If I shade in straight lines, I'm able to do that quickly. The hundredths. The hundredths are my little itty bitty squares, and I did shade some of those in. If I count the little itty bitty squares, I'll have 7, or I should have 7. I can double check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So my decimal is going to be just like it is on my place value chart. 0.07. 0.07. My fraction's going to look a little bit different now. All the fractions that we did from yesterday and from our homework all had the same denominator. The denominator for all of those fractions was 10, because our models were cut up into tenths. There were only 10 pieces. These models are a little bit different. Who remembers how many little teeny tiny squares are inside this model? Carly, how many little teeny tiny squares are inside the model?
100.
100. So when I make my fraction, my denominator is going to be 100. And out of all 100 of those squares, how many did I shade in? Alexa?
7.
7. So my fraction is 7 out of 100. Now here's the good thing about the fractions. Okay? For the fractions, I can use my place value chart to help me out here. My denominator, the bottom number, is going to come from the smallest decimal I have. So if the smallest decimal I have is the 10th, my denominator is 10. If, like in this number, I have a smaller decimal than the 10th, like in this case I have the hundredths, then my denominator is 100. The numerator, all I have to do is look what numbers I have after my decimal. Whatever numbers I have after my decimal, that's my numerator. So for this one, I only had 7. That means that my numerator is 7. My smallest decimal was 100th, so my denominator is 100. For our sentence, blank whole and blank hundredths out of blank. Well, again, we didn't shade in a whole model. So 0, 0 whole. And blank hundredths. How many hundredths did I shade in? How many of those little squares did I shade in? Shading?
7.
7. 0 whole and 7 hundredths out of, and how many little
100.
teeny tiny squares were there? Alexa?
Me? 100.
100. 0 whole, 7 hundredths out of 100. The expanded notation. I've got a 0 in the ones place, so I can skip that. I've got a 0 in the tenths place, so I can skip that. I've got a 7 in the hundredths place. I can't skip a 7. So I have 7 times, and I have to show what place value that 7 was in. Well, if I look on top of the hundredths place, this shows me what place value it was in. 7 times 0.01. And that's it, because again, in expanded notation, I can skip any place value that has a 0. In the word form, no ones, no tenths, only 7 hundredths. Oh, sorry, I forgot a D here. 7 hundredths.